If you call me help one more time, make sure your husband can afford what that mistake is about to cost him. The sentence didn't come from the stage. It didn't come from security. It came from the tall black man standing beside table 12 in a midnight charcoal suit that fit too well to be rented and a watch that caught the chandelier light without asking for attention. For half a second, nobody in the grand ballroom moved. Then Victoria Ashford laughed like she had just been handed the evening's best entertainment. The Crystal Crown Hotel glittered around her in gold light and polished glass. Every inch of the charity tech gala designed to make power feel comfortable. Servers floated past with silver trays. A string quartet played too softly to interrupt rich people talking over it. At the center of it all stood Victoria, one manicured hand wrapped around a champagne flute, the other pointing directly at the man she'd mistaken for staff. "There you are," she said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I've been asking for fresh napkins for 5 minutes. Honestly, does nobody train the help anymore?" A few people smiled into their drinks. Others looked away the way people do when money says something ugly and everyone pretends not to notice. The man didn't reach for the napkins stacked nearby. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself. He only looked at Victoria with a calm, unreadable expression that somehow made her voice sharpen. "Well," she pressed, "do I need to repeat myself?" Across the room, an event coordinator named Nina Brooks froze mid-step. She knew exactly who the man was. She also knew who Victoria Ashford was. And in rooms like this, recognition didn't always outrank wealth. Nina started forward, then stopped when Victoria lifted her chin and gave the kind of smile meant to remind everyone that her last name had paid for half the auction items in the ballroom. "Some people," Victoria said, glancing around for an audience, "get one nice jacket and start wandering where they don't belong." That pulled a few quiet laughs from the people desperate to stay in her orbit. Phones stayed low, but eyes lifted. The room had begun to tilt toward spectacle. The man finally spoke, his voice low, even, and clean enough to cut through the music without rising. "Ma'am, I'm not staff." That should have ended it. Instead, Victoria's smile widened. "That's adorable," she said. "Now either bring the napkins or find someone who knows how to do their job." Her husband, Richard Ashford, was across the ballroom near the investor wall, shaking hands beneath a massive digital screen cycling through the names of startup founders, fund managers, and keynote sponsors. He hadn't noticed yet. Victoria kept going because people like her always did when they thought the room was still theirs. "I swear," she murmured, just loud enough to carry. "People see a luxury hotel and suddenly think they belong in the VIP section." The man adjusted one cuff, then glanced past her toward the stage where the master of ceremonies was preparing to begin. Something about that tiny movement made Nina's stomach drop. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't cornered. He was waiting. And when Victoria snapped her fingers one more time and said, "Help should really learn to move faster," the man looked back at her, gave the smallest nod and said, "Mrs. Ashford, before this night is over, you're going to wish you'd asked my name instead." The warning in Malik Carter's voice should have slowed her down. Instead, it only made Victoria Ashford lean deeper into the performance. She set her champagne flute on the edge of the white linen tablecloth and looked him up and down with the polished contempt of a woman who had spent years confusing money with moral authority. "Did you hear that?" she asked the table beside her. "Now the help is making threats." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the nearest guests. Not warm laughter, not comfortable laughter, the kind people use when they are checking the room before deciding which side power is on. Malik did not move. He stood exactly where he had been, shoulders relaxed, expression calm, one hand resting lightly near the back of an empty chair at table 12. The ballroom lights washed everything in gold, turning crystal glasses into tiny mirrors. Across the far wall, a 12-foot LED screen rotated sponsor logos and founder names in slow silence, though no one near Victoria seemed to be reading it. They were too busy watching her. That was the part she liked. Not the gala itself. Not the charitable cause. The audience. "Ma'am," Nina Brooks said carefully as she finally stepped forward, her event badge catching. The chandelier light, There has been a misunderstanding. Victoria turned toward her with the kind of smile that looked expensive and dangerous at the same time. Yes, there has, she said. I asked for service 5 minutes ago. Nina's throat tightened. She knew this room. She knew these people. Most of all, she knew the difference between someone who rented influence and someone who built it. But Victoria did not give her room to fix anything. If your staff is confused, Victoria continued, lowering her voice only enough to make people lean in, that sounds like an event problem, not a me problem. Several nearby donors suddenly found their auction catalogs very interesting. Nobody stepped in. Nobody corrected her. The silence around rich cruelty had settled in like a second carpet. Malik looked at Nina, not to rescue her, not to plead, but almost to let her know he understood exactly why she had stopped short. He had seen this before. The way a room could recognize the truth and still kneel to the wrong person for 10 more seconds. Victoria mistook that glance for weakness. There it is, she said, folding her arms. That look. They always act offended when they are corrected. Nina inhaled sharply. A man near the dessert station turned just enough for his wife to whisper, "Is that who I think it is?" Her husband shushed her without taking his eyes off Malik. The room was changing in tiny ways now. Heads tilting, brows tightening, recognition moving in pockets, not yet reaching the center. But Victoria was still too sure of herself to notice. She tapped one nail against the table. Security should have cleared this section better, she said. This is what happens when people start mistaking access for belonging. Malik finally answered, his tone so steady it made her sound louder by comparison. You keep using the word belonging like it was handed to you. That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but several faces shifted. Victoria heard it too and took a half step forward, the smile leaving her mouth. Excuse me? She asked. Malik's eyes lifted past her shoulder toward the investor wall where Richard Ashford was still shaking hands under the scrolling presentation for Helix Labs, the company everyone important had come to discuss. Then he looked back at her and said, Nothing. Please continue. You are making this much easier for me than I expected. Victoria Ashford did continue, and that was exactly the problem. She lifted her champagne again, but this time her hand was less steady, not shaking, not enough for most people to notice, just enough for Malik to see that the first crack had formed. Around them, the ballroom had grown quieter in that unnatural way rich rooms do when everyone pretends nothing is happening while listening to every word. The quartet kept playing near the stage, soft and elegant, but even the violins now felt like background to something sharper. Victoria glanced toward Nina Brooks with open irritation. I do not know what kind of stunt this is, she said, but if your event staff thinks sarcasm passes for professionalism, you may want to revisit your hiring standards. Nina opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes flicked from Victoria to Malik, then to the giant investor screen at the far end of the room. The screen had just shifted again. Helix Labs glowed in bright white letters over a rotating image of a sleek medical interface, followed by a line that read, Private Founder Reception immediately following remarks. Several people saw it at once. Several people saw Malik standing directly beneath that reflected light. And several of those same people still said nothing, because silence in rooms like this always waited to see who would win before deciding what it believed. Victoria mistook that silence for support. You know what I think? She said, stepping closer. I think you walked in here, saw a luxury ballroom, saw an open seat, saw important people, and decided to play dress up for one night. A few people winced. One donor near the auction table quietly lowered his glass. Another turned just enough to whisper, She really does not know. His wife whispered back, No, and that is making this worse by the second. Malik heard both and gave no sign. He only watched Victoria with that same controlled stillness that made her words feel messier every time they left her mouth. Do you always do this? He asked. His tone was mild, almost curious. Mistake stillness for permission? Victoria let out a short laugh. No, I mistake confidence for competence all the time, though. usually from men trying very hard to stand where they have not been invited. Across the ballroom, Richard Ashford had finally started moving in their direction. He was still smiling, still performing ease for a cluster of investors, but his pace had changed. He had noticed the eyes turning. He had noticed the room bending toward table 12. He just had not yet heard enough to understand why. Nina noticed him too and seemed to make a decision. She stepped in again, her voice careful but firmer this time. "Mrs. Ashford, I really think we should clear this up privately." Victoria turned on her with immediate frost. "There is nothing to clear up privately," she said. "If he is not staff, then why is he standing here like he is waiting for instructions?" Malik looked down at the place card beside the empty chair he had been resting his hand near. Then he looked back at Victoria. "Because," he said, "that seat is mine." The words did not land like a shout. They landed like a lock clicking shut. Victoria followed his gaze to the card, finally seeing what had been in front of her the entire time. The thick cream stock, the embossed border, the black lettering she had not bothered to read. Mr. Malik Carter, founder and chief executive officer, Helix Labs. For the first time that night, Victoria Ashford said nothing at all. The silence did not last long. It almost never did in rooms built on image. Victoria Ashford recovered the way people like her always recovered at first, not by admitting error, but by reaching for a smaller lie she thought she could still control. Her lips parted into something that tried to look amused. "Well," she said lightly, eyes still on the place card. "That should have been made clearer." The line fell flat. Nobody laughed this time. Not at her table. Not near the auction stage. Not even from the group of investors pretending to check their phones while listening to every breath. Malik Carter did not rescue her. He did not soften the moment. He simply pulled out the chair with his name on it and sat down with the ease of a man entering a room he had built no matter who had tried to block the door. The white linen barely rustled. The sound of glassware and silverware seemed suddenly too loud around him. Nina Brooks exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 minutes. She stepped closer, posture careful, voice pitched low enough to sound professional and high enough to be heard by the right people. "Mr. Carter, I am deeply sorry for the confusion." Malik looked up at her, calm as ever. "It was not confusion," he said. "But thank you." That sentence moved through the nearest tables like cold air under a door. Victoria's jaw tightened. She reached for her champagne again and found the glass empty. Across the ballroom, Richard Ashford had now fully broken from his investor circle. He was walking toward them with that controlled speed wealthy men use when they are trying not to look like they are rushing into trouble. His expression had not collapsed yet, but the performance was thinning. He had seen Nina's face. He had seen Victoria standing instead of smiling. He had seen Malik seated under the Helix Labs screen. That was enough to make any intelligent man nervous. Victoria noticed him coming and seized the chance like a lifeline. "Richard," she called, just a little too brightly. There was a misunderstanding with seating. Malik's eyes lifted once, briefly, toward Richard, then returned to the menu card in front of him as though this had become the least urgent part of his evening. That, more than anything, unsettled the room. Men who needed approval usually explained themselves. Men who held leverage did not. Richard reached the table and took in the scene in one sweep. The chair, the place card, Nina, his wife, Malik. Something in his face changed with brutal speed. It was small, a tightening near the eyes. Pause one beat too long. But everyone near enough to see it understood the message. He knew exactly who Malik Carter was. Victoria saw that knowledge hit her husband before he spoke and, for the first time all night, uncertainty flashed naked across her face. "Richard," she said again, quieter now. "Apparently this is Mr. Carter." Richard did not answer her immediately. He looked at Malik and gave the kind of nod powerful men reserve for people whose signature can move markets. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "I was hoping we would have a chance to speak before the presentation." Malik folded his hands once on the table. "Your wife and I have already been introduced," he said. No one moved. No one sipped. Even the quartet near the stage seemed to shrink into the background. Victoria turned toward Richard with a smile that was now more plea than poise. I did not know who he was. Richard closed his eyes for the smallest fraction of a second. Not enough to be called a reaction, just enough to be remembered. Then his phone buzzed in his hand. He looked down. The screen lit his face. Whatever he read there took the color out of it all at once. Richard Ashford stared at his phone as if the screen had turned into a trapdoor. The glow from the message reflected against his face, flattening every trace of public charm he had worn all evening. Around him, the ballroom remained polished and beautiful, but the energy had shifted completely. Conversations had thinned into whispers. Silverware rested untouched. Even the servers seemed to move more carefully now, as if they could feel the pressure gathering at table 12. Victoria leaned toward her husband, lowering her voice without lowering her panic. What is it? She asked. Richard did not answer right away. His thumb hovered over the message, then over a second alert that had just appeared beneath it. Legal. Board. Urgent. Malik Carter watched him with the same maddening calm, one hand resting beside the place card that had already done more damage than any speech could have. Nina Brooks stood a few feet away, frozen between professional duty and the awareness that she was witnessing the exact second a room changed owners without anyone physically moving. Richard finally looked up. Mr. Carter, he said, voice tightened into something formal. I think there may have been a serious misunderstanding tonight. Malik lifted his water glass, took one measured sip, and set it down with care. There was no misunderstanding on my side, he said. Victoria gave a breathless laugh that sounded painful even to her own ears. Oh, come on. This does not need to become a whole thing. I made a mistake. People make mistakes. That was when several nearby heads turned more openly, because everyone in earshot knew it had already become a whole thing. Not when she called him help. Not when she tried to shame him in front of donors. Not even when she learned whose seat she had taken. It became a whole thing when Richard Ashford read whatever was on that phone and forgot how to hide fear. He stepped slightly away from the table, angling the screen from his wife, but not before she caught the subject line. Helix exclusivity suspended. Her face changed so fast it looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under her posture. Richard, she whispered. No performance left now. What does that mean? He still did not answer her. He looked at Malik instead, as if hoping there might still be some private version of this ending available for purchase. You suspended the exclusivity window? He asked quietly. Malik did not rush the moment. He let the question sit long enough for the people closest to hear it clearly. He let the words settle into the expensive air. Exclusivity window. Suspended. So that was the shape of the power in front of them. Not vague influence. Not social prestige. Terms. Signatures. Deadlines. Leverage. At 8:47, Malik said, glancing briefly at the watch Victoria had first mistaken for decoration. My attorneys sent notice to your office that Helix Labs is no longer negotiating exclusively with Ashford Capital. Nobody breathed loudly after that. The investor wall behind him continued rotating names and numbers as though the night had not split in two. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came out. Richard lowered his phone slowly, the way a man lowers something heavy after realizing it is real. Because of this? He asked. Malik looked up at him, expression unreadable. No, he said, because this revealed exactly how your family behaves when you think no one important is watching. Then he turned his gaze to Victoria, who had finally gone completely silent, and for the first time all evening, the woman who had tried to reduce him to service had nothing left to say. The room stayed quiet, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that comes after everyone realizes the wrong person just lost control. Victoria Ashford stood beside the table with her spine still straight, her chin still lifted, but the confidence was gone now. What remained was posture without power. Around her, donors, founders, investors, and board members had stopped pretending not to watch. A few phones were no longer hidden. They rested openly at chest level, screens glowing, not because anyone wanted to be rude, but because moments like this had a way of becoming stories before dessert was served. Richard Ashford looked as though he had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. He checked his phone again, then once more, as if a different message might appear if he stared hard enough. It did. Another alert. Then another. Legal counsel. Strategy team. Investor relations. The chain reaction had already begun. Nina Brooks stepped backward, giving the table more space, but her eyes never left Malik Carter. Neither did anyone else's. That was the strange thing about real power. It did not need to raise its voice. It only needed to be named at the right moment. Richard swallowed and lowered his tone, trying to build a bridge with words that now sounded painfully late. Mr. Carter, Ashford Capital has spent months preparing for this partnership. We have teams in 3 states working on the rollout. We have hospitals waiting on the pilot integration. If there is a way to discuss this privately, I would welcome that. Malik rested one hand beside his water glass and looked at him with calm precision. You had a private opportunity, he said. It was the moment your wife decided whether to treat a stranger with basic respect. Victoria finally found her voice, but it came out smaller than before. I said I made a mistake. Malik turned to her, not harsh, not loud, just exact. No, a mistake is stepping into the wrong room. A mistake is reading the wrong name card. What you did was reveal your instincts. That hit harder than any insult could have. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed again. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies had reached the podium and was quietly conferring with the producer, clearly unsure whether to continue the program while one of the biggest deals of the year was collapsing in front of the donor tables. The giant screen still displayed Helix Labs behind Malik's seat, and now it looked less like branding and more like judgment. Richard took one slow breath, then another, forcing himself back into negotiation mode because men like him only knew how to survive through transactions. What would it take, he asked carefully, to reopen the conversation? Several people nearby reacted to that, subtle but visible. A lifted brow, a shifted glass. There it was. Not apology, not accountability. Terms. Malik noticed it too. Of course he did. That is the problem, he said. You still think this is about access. It is about trust. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time the sound seemed louder than the music. He looked down and the blood drained from his face for the second time that night. Victoria saw it and whispered, "What now?" Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. Then he looked up at Malik, and for the first time, the billionaire in the room sounded like a man asking permission. Our competitor just requested an emergency meeting with your board, he said. Malik gave the faintest nod. Yes, he replied. I know. They were very polite. Richard Ashford did not speak after that. He just stood there with his phone in his hand, staring at Malik Carter like the rules of the room had changed too fast for him to catch up. Around table 12, the air had gone thin. Not physically, socially. The kind of silence that makes crystal glasses feel louder than conversation. Victoria Ashford looked from her husband to Malik and back again, searching for some opening that still belonged to her. There was none. The ballroom had already moved on without moving at all. Donors who had been laughing 20 minutes earlier were now studying her the way people study a headline they wish had happened to someone else. A server passed by with a tray of sparkling water, slowed for half a step, then kept going. Even that tiny hesitation felt public. Victoria drew in a careful breath and tried again, reaching for dignity the way people reach for a dropped necklace in the dark. Surely, she said, managing a smile that did not survive her own voice. We are not going to let one uncomfortable exchange destroy a business opportunity this large. Malik did not answer immediately. He let the words settle in front of everyone. Uncomfortable exchange. That was what she had chosen. Not humiliation. Not public contempt. Not the instinct to assign a black man the role of service because it made her feel taller. An uncomfortable exchange. When he finally looked at her, his expression was calm enough to be devastating. That depends, he said. Do you usually describe character as an inconvenience when it becomes expensive? A few people nearby lowered their eyes. Not from embarrassment for him. From embarrassment for her. Richard finally slipped his phone into his jacket pocket, But the motion looked less composed now, more like a man trying to hide. The fact that his hands had lost certainty. He stepped closer to the table and lowered his voice. "Mr. Carter, I understand the optics of this are bad." Malik's gaze sharpened almost invisibly. "The optics," he repeated. Richard realized his mistake the moment the word left his mouth. So did everyone else. Because there it was again. The habit. The reflex. Not what happened. How it looked. Not harm. Optics. Nina Brooks looked down as if she needed to check the seating chart. But she was really giving him somewhere to put his failure besides the center of the ballroom. Malik leaned back slightly in his chair. Not defensive. Not casual. Centered. "This is why the exclusivity window closed," he said. "Not because your wife embarrassed me. Because both of you keep proving you only understand consequences when they show up on a screen." Victoria's eyes flashed. For the first time, there was less fear than anger in them, the anger of someone who was used to being corrected privately, softened socially, and protected structurally. "You are enjoying this," she said. Malik's face did not change. "No," he said. "I am measuring it." That answer stayed in the air. Measured. Counted. Logged. Around them, several people who had remained silent earlier were no longer pretending. One founder at the next table murmured something to his investor. A woman near the auction display lifted her phone and turned the screen toward her friend. Richard heard the low current of whispers and knew exactly what it meant. The story was moving beyond the ballroom now. Not tomorrow. Not after the gala. Now. Victoria heard it too. Her posture wavered for the first time. "Richard," she said under her breath. "Say something." He looked at her then. Really looked at her, and whatever he saw on her face only made his own expression harder. But before he could answer, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, the microphone catching a soft burst of static, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight's keynote, we have the honor of recognizing the visionary founder whose platform may reshape medical access across America." Every eye in the room turned toward Malik Carter. For one suspended second, even Victoria Ashford forgot to breathe. The spotlight from the stage shifted across the ballroom and caught the edge of Malik Carter's chair, the white linen, the glassware, the rigid line of Richard Ashford's shoulders. Then the master of ceremonies smiled toward table 12 and said, "Please join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer of Helix Labs, Mr. Malik Carter." Applause began at the front of the room, strong and immediate, then spread outward in waves as recognition finally outran hesitation. People stood. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make the difference visible. Enough to make Victoria understand that the room she had tried to control had never really belonged to her at all. Malik rose without hurry. He buttoned his jacket once, glanced toward the stage, and gave Nina Brooks the smallest nod as he stepped away from the table. Nina moved aside instantly, relief and admiration mixing in her expression. Richard watched him go like a man seeing a door close in slow motion. Victoria stayed frozen beside the chair she should never have occupied, one hand pressed lightly against the stem of an untouched glass, as though stillness might somehow keep the night from getting worse. It did not. The investor screen behind the stage brightened, and Helix Labs filled the ballroom wall in clean white letters over deep blue light. Beneath it came Malik's name, then a short line about national medical access, rural diagnostics, and expansion partnerships that would change care delivery in all 50 states. The words looked enormous above him. So did the truth. A few feet away, someone at a neighboring table whispered. She called him help. Another voice answered, "In front of everybody." The whispers were not quiet enough anymore. They moved like wine through the room, impossible to pull back once released. Richard's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Then it buzzed once more. This time Victoria saw the screen light with the name of a board member and understood the disaster had already left the ballroom. Malik reached the stage steps and turned slightly as one of the organizers extended a hand. The cameras near the podium angled toward him. So did the phones around the room. He could have looked triumphant. He did not. He looked composed, which was somehow worse for the people who had just tried to diminish him. Composure made humiliation permanent. The master of ceremonies stepped back from the microphone with a bright smile that now seemed half genuine and half nervous. "We are honored to have him here tonight," she said. "His work is already shaping the future." Malik took the microphone with one hand and let the applause fade on its own. He did not speak immediately. He looked across the ballroom instead, over the donor tables, over the auction displays, over the polished glasses and pressed tuxedos and glittering gowns, until his gaze stopped for half a heartbeat on the Ashfords. Victoria dropped her eyes first. Richard did not. He could not. Then Malik faced the room and said, "Thank you. It is always revealing to see who believes in innovation and who only believes in appearances." The line hit the ballroom like a change in temperature. No names, no raised voice, no scene, just precision. And as the room absorbed what he had done without ever having to explain it, Victoria's phone began to ring too. She looked down at the screen, saw who was calling, and went pale enough for Richard to notice. He leaned toward her, but she did not answer him. She only stared at the name, then at the stage, and for the first time all evening, the woman who had thought she could command the room looked like she wanted to disappear inside it. Victoria Ashford let the phone ring 3 times before Richard snatched a look at the screen and understood why her face had gone white. It was not a friend, not a social call, not someone checking in from another table. It was a member of the Ashford Capital Board, and beneath that missed call sat 2 new messages waiting in a stack that had appeared too fast to ignore. Around them, the ballroom had fully turned. Nobody was pretending anymore. People who had once angled themselves toward Victoria for access were now angling away from her for safety. The shift was subtle but brutal. Chairs remained in place. Smiles did not. At the front of the room, Malik Carter stood beneath the Helix Labs screen, one hand resting lightly against the podium as the applause faded. He did not rush his remarks. He did not use the stage to punish anyone directly. That made it worse. He spoke about trust in technology, trust in leadership, and trust in the people who build systems that claim to serve everyone. His voice stayed measured, steady, and precise. Every sentence sounded bigger because the room knew exactly what had happened just minutes earlier. Every mention of integrity landed like a mirror. Richard listened with the rigid stillness of a man hearing a market correction in real time. Victoria did not listen at all. She was staring at her phone, then at the stage, then back at her phone as if one of those directions might offer a way out. It did not. Another buzz. Another message. This time Richard saw enough before she tilted the screen away. A board member had written only 6 words. "We need to discuss tonight immediately." That was when Richard finally spoke to her in a voice so low nobody else should have heard it. But the table beside them did. "You should have stopped talking." Victoria turned toward him as if she had been struck by the sentence itself. "Do not do that," she whispered. "Do not put this all on me." Richard's expression hardened. Not loud, not theatrical, just stripped of all public softness. "You did that yourself." Nearby, someone lifted a glass and set it back down without taking a sip. Someone else quietly excused themselves from the table, not wanting to be seated too near the wreckage when the room remembered this night later. On stage, Malik reached the end of his remarks with the same control he had held all evening. He thanked the organizers, thanked the medical partners who believed in the work, and thanked the communities Helix Labs was built to serve. Then he stepped away from the podium to a standing ovation that was fuller now than before. Not just admiration, alignment. People were choosing sides in public. As he moved down from the stage, investors shifted toward the aisle, waiting for a chance to speak with him. Competitors did too. Whatever private leverage Ashford Capital thought it still had was evaporating under chandelier light. Richard saw it. Of course he saw it. That was the punishment built for men like him. Not a shout. Not a scandal in secret. Loss, measured in relationships, access, and timing. Victoria stood motionless as Malik approached the table one last time, not to reclaim anything, not to make a show of leaving, but simply to pick up the black leather portfolio she had never noticed resting beside his chair from the moment she mistook him for staff. He slipped it under one arm and looked at the Ashfords with calm finality. Richard opened his mouth, perhaps to ask for one more meeting, one more chance, one more private conversation that could still save the deal. Malik did not let him begin. "You did not lose Helix tonight because I was offended," he said. "You lost it because character always shows up before contracts do." Then his gaze shifted to Victoria, who could not seem to lift her eyes high enough to meet his. And because some people only recognize value after they insult it. He walked away without waiting for a response. The crowd opened for him at once. Investors followed. Organizers hurried beside him. Nina Brooks stood near the aisle and watched him go with the expression of someone who had just seen a room taught a lesson it would never admit it needed. Behind him, Victoria remained beside the table in a silence so complete it seemed to erase every sharp word she had thrown into the air earlier. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time he did not even look at it. He already knew what the rest of the night would be. Calls, damage control, explanations, board pressure, competitors circling. And none of it would change the one thing that mattered most. In a ballroom full of witnesses, his wife had shown the room exactly how little they valued dignity when they thought power belonged only to people who looked the part. By the time dessert was served, the story had already spread beyond the hotel. By morning, the photos would be online, the whispers would have names, and the deal everyone came to celebrate would belong to someone else. But at table 12, long after Malik Carter disappeared into the crowd that now rose to greet him, Victoria Ashford still had not moved, and she still had not said a single word.